Record. There we are. Okay, everybody. I'm Ronelle Delmont, and I'm here with Gregory Ahlgren. He's the fellow that co-authored the book that I made a website because I was so blown away by that book when I read it in 1994. It was already a year old, and I found it by accident in the library because I was doing research for Crime of the Century. The summer of '94, you probably all forgot, was that fellow, what's his name, Simpson? What was his first name? I never heard of the guy until he got arrested. OJ. Yeah, I didn't know anything about football. So I went looking for crime of the century in the summer of '94, and I discovered these two guys who wrote this crackpot book I couldn't believe. My hero Lindbergh, guilty of kidnapping his own baby, perhaps, or whatever. I was sure these two guys were crackpots. The authors' names are Stephen Monier. Gregory, does he say it Monier or Monier?
He says it Monier.
Monier. Okay, Stephen Monier, and here is Gregory Ahlgren, who is a defense attorney, and of course Stephen Monier was chief of police of Goffstown, New Hampshire. So I just want to quickly explain something about these two fellows who wrote this book. Until I read it, I was sure they were crackpots. But something happened to me when I was about 20 years old. And I never told this to Gregory, so I'm going to say it now. I was very young and innocent and from Brooklyn with my first husband. We were opening an antique shop on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. So we took a little trip to London, and we went to the flea markets there and all of that stuff when I was very young. And we went into a bank, a beautiful Victorian bank, marble and ormolu and everything, and people speaking with Oxford accents. And my husband, his name was David Migden, he went to exchange some money, but he started arguing with the teller because the money wasn't the correct amount. Now, we're from Brooklyn. We went to city public schools, and we'd never been further away from home than the Catskill Mountains. And here we were in London in a bank that looked like royalty. And the guy is giving my husband money that he says, this isn't right. This is the wrong amount. So the teller said to him, you don't like it, go to the next teller. So we went to the next teller. And that teller gave my husband the same amount, and he said, this is wrong. And we moved over to the third teller. And by the time, after a couple of minutes, we got whisked into the manager's office, bank manager's office. And he heard the two Brooklyn people here who don't like his monetary exchange rate, and he picked up a pen. I'll never forget this, because when I read this book, I read it in '94, and this happened to me in 64, 60, yeah. So 30 years had passed. But this is all I could remember reading their book, is that when we got into the manager's office, and he was angry because these two young people from Brooklyn don't know mathematics, and he picked up a pad and a pen, and he started to teach my husband arithmetic. And lo and behold, he had the right number. And what was wrong with the tellers? They were all fact checking each other's numbers, which were wrong. Each one of them was going over the other guy's numbers and coming up with the same wrong numbers. When I read Ahlgren and Monier's book, Crime of the Century, the Lindbergh Kidnapping Hoax, in spite of the fact that Lindbergh was my hero since I was a child, I kept thinking of the guys in the bank, they're all, and here are two guys in New Hampshire. I'm sorry, nobody ever heard of you two. You were not famous, you were not celebrities, and you were not Seymour Hersh or any of these great reporters. And yet, just by using a clean sheet of paper, so to speak, that's how I thought of your book, that it was starting from scratch with nobody else's biases and prejudices and false numbers. So that's my introduction. Gregory, please tell us how you got to write this book, or anything you want to say. I got my chance to explain to you publicly how I became enthralled by the idea that you could take a piece of history that everyone thought they knew about and change it, because you have. I mean, even Noel Bain, who was writing a book at the same time as you guys, he never pointed a finger at Lindbergh. He just said Lindbergh covered up the activities and the murder of his sister-in-law, but he was not saying what the two of you were saying, that this great hero had accidentally killed his son and covered it up. Nobody did that. So here you go. A long introduction. Sorry about that.
No, I like that anecdote, and that's a good example, and
Yeah.
there's a lesson in there for all of us, because there
Yeah.
are so many aspects in life where that is true. We kind of assume the accuracy of people who have done work before us in a number of fields, and I won't bore the audience with my own anecdotes along that line, but I've seen that pattern of behavior, sort of that pattern of analysis, or really lack of analysis, that a lot of people promote. Now, I never started out with the intention of writing a book. I really stumbled onto the Lindbergh project almost by accident. I was preparing to move one time. My wife and I had bought a house. We were living in Goffstown, New Hampshire, and we were moving, selling our house and moving to Manchester, where our parents were, to be closer to our parents and to our daughter's day school and my work, etc. And as you tend to do when you're packing, you're looking for some distraction to avoid a sort of unpleasant and boring task. And I happened to come across this paperback book that was sort of an anthology of famous crimes. It had a chapter on, excuse me, about 10 or 11 crimes in America that had, Leopold and Loeb and Fatty Arbuckle, and one of them was the Lindbergh case. So, not knowing a thing about the case, I just flipped through it and started reading the article. It was an article by a fellow by the name of Alan Hine. He had written it in the late 1940s. And in the article, he talked about the craziness of the case, how there were these disjointed factors that didn't seem to add up, that made no sense, that sort of continued to cast a sort of a pall of mystery over the whole Lindbergh case. But at that time, I was a criminal defense lawyer, and I had tried a lot of cases. Even though it was 1993, I still had a lot of experience by that point. And as I was reading those factors, I was saying, there's another factor here. There's another possible construct of the facts. And like yourself with the blank piece of paper, I started asking myself, well, was it ever proved that there had been a stranger abduction? Because even back then, there were a number of cases that had come to the attention of America, where people or parents had done some act, injured their child through negligence or child abuse or whatever, and then had concocted some sort of story. And we see that in homicide cases, right? We see that where a husband has killed their spouse and then says, some stranger came through the door and killed my wife, and I'm not responsible, and try to throw suspicion off. And usually when the police investigate those crimes today, and even back in the 1990s, they don't assume that what the witnesses tell them is true. They start with, well, what are the facts? Let's do our own investigation, come to an assessment of what happened, and then from there try to develop who was responsible for the act. But that never seemed to have been done with Lindbergh. It seemed like he made a report that his son had been abducted, and everyone just sort of started their investigation from that assumption. And so that got me thinking about the case, and I shared it. I knew Steve Monier. He and I actually were adversaries at the time. He was the chief of police in Goffstown, and he was also the town prosecutor. And he and I had crossed swords over the years, but I had a respect for him and also for his intellectual honesty. And so I photocopied the article and I sent it to him, just sort of on a whim, just to think, just to see what he thought about it. And he got back to me a few weeks later, and he had the same concerns. So more as a hobby, we started researching the issue. We would, started pulling down books on Lindbergh. Or, at first we did a lot of secondary sources. We looked at other biographies of Lindbergh. We looked at what other people had written about the crime. We tried to develop a sort of a timeline, as it were, of the incident, of the facts of March 1, 1932. And when you're researching an historical event, people always say, well, you shouldn't use secondary sources. But when you're researching a historical event that even at that time was 60 years old, you have to start with secondary sources. I mean, right? If you were writing a book now about Charlemagne, you couldn't go interview people who knew him. You'd have to start with secondary sources, and so that's what we did. But even within the framework of secondary sources, there was a pretty well-established timeline. There was some minor disputes as to who did what at what time, and so we tried to develop a whole picture of what happened that night and what were the events that had led to March 1, 1932. And as we did, we had really serious doubts as to whether there was sufficient evidence of a third party abduction, whether a stranger had actually come through the window and kidnapped a child. That didn't mean we had evidence as to what had happened.
Right.
And it seemed like everyone else who had written before us had kind of started with the assumption, well, there was definitely a kidnapping, who did it? And a lot of them had come to the conclusion it didn't make any sense that Hauptmann had done it. To us, Hauptmann was almost irrelevant. He was almost a minor character. We weren't really that interested in Hauptmann. We were interested in what happened on March 1.
A lot of people believe Hauptmann was chosen. Lots of people write to me and I hear all kinds of theories. And there are a number of people who believe Hauptmann was chosen early, was framed on purpose even before the child went missing. That's there's so many theories. Oh my goodness. And yours was so believable. It still is actually, that he was accidentally killed by Lindbergh doing a prank, that I have to sometimes stop, and think that's still a legitimate argument, except there are too many reasons. I mean, there's the eugenics problem, which I don't think you had in your book. Lindbergh as a eugenicist, and that's something may have been wrong with the child. Did you and Steve consider that? That
Yeah, we're fairly confident that it's more reasonable than not that there was not a stranger abduction.
right,
Beyond that, I think what actually did happen is somewhat speculative.
right,
There is since our book, I think our book was the first to set out the theory or the possibility that there was no stranger abduction. Now,
exactly.
since our book has come out, a number of other people have gone on from there and said, well, if there was no stranger abduction, then who did it? And there's been blame placed on other family members, on conspiracies, on the fact that it was an intentional act. We consider the possibility, once we became convinced that it was reasonable that there was no stranger abduction, then the question is, what did happen, obviously. And you'd have to consider, in any case like this, you'd have to consider the possibility of child abuse. I mean, there are so many cases in the media over the years we can talk about where a child has died at the negligent hands of one or both parents, and the parents have concocted a stranger abduction story. So that's always got to be a possibility. And I think if the police were investigating the case today, they would entertain that and they would pursue it. Well, 60 years after the event, it's kind of hard to pursue it. We can't go out and interview witnesses with firsthand knowledge of Lindbergh's relationship with his child, or his relationship with Anne, or the mother's relationship with the child. So we have to rely on secondary sources, which again are not that necessarily that accurate, because you're sort of a glossy image of celebrities, and certainly Lindbergh was a celebrity.
And
So
excuse me, uh, the the biggest thing, the most convincing, I don't think anybody, when you wrote your book, people had forgotten. They just knew Lindbergh baby kidnapping Lindbergh, but people didn't realize what you point out in your book is that he took over the case. He commandeered the entire investigation. That's one of the things that made you and Steve suspicious, wasn't it? That it was a prank that he was covering up for, that he
But we're
had,
suspicious that there was no strange abduction. I mean,
right.
that it was a prank. There were facts that support that there was a prank that went bad. He had a history of
Right.
playing pranks on close family members, including his own wife.
And no one knew that. You revealed something so shocking. One of the things that's uh, blew me away in your book, because I immediately got Anne's diary after reading your book, and there it is, her letter to her mother-in-law on the night that it's happening. You and Steve point to that, and that's one of the most important observations of your book is that she wrote her mother-in-law that we thought it was a prank. Remember your book. I'll never forget it when I read uh, that letter in her. For some reason, she never destroyed that letter, and it's published in her diary there. Uh, she told her mother-in-law that we thought Charles took him as a joke. Nobody
Right.
ever connected that dot. You were the first people who
Well,
did
she
that.
said that was her first thought.
Yeah, but her first thought, but who went around finding her first? You and Steve. That's what I'm saying. That was so remarkable about your book is that you point very you've got observations that were mind blowing for me that she thought her husband took him as a joke. I once lost my son. He was a baby in a stroller in May in a department store. I was looking at shirts. And my son, I turned around, he's not there. I went crazy for, I don't know, it felt like an eternity, but it must have been only 5 or 10 minutes. He was sleeping under the shirts and he didn't hear me calling his name. He was a little baby, probably the same age as little Charlie. And my son was asleep under the shirts right by my feet, but I couldn't see him. I was hysterical. That experience was so horrific. I cannot imagine a husband, a father doing that to his wife. And you point this out. This is a cruel individual who's probably a psychopath. So how did you observe that? I mean, you were investigating the case like it might have been in 93.
Well, right. Well, whether he took the child himself that night or not, we know that he had taken the child on prior occasion.
Right.
And had claimed to everybody that the child had been kidnapped. He later claimed that that was a joke he was playing on his wife. I don't know in what universe anyone would consider that to be a funny
Right.
joke. It just isn't. So it's kind of coincidental that a few weeks, you take the child, you hide the child in the closet, you claim the child has been kidnapped, you throw the whole household into an uproar, and then later say it's a joke. And then, just a few short weeks later, the same thing happened. That's just, I don't believe in coincidences. Police officers especially often say they don't believe in coincidences.
Right.
And I understand coincidences sometimes happen, but if you look at the facts of what happened on March 1, there's just too many coincidences.
Right. Didn't you? Maybe I remember it wrongly because I looked up the dates and they seem not to coincide. But didn't you put Susan Smith in your book? And she came later. Your book was published in '93, and I think her event was she put her two kids in the lake in the car in North Carolina.
I remember that case.
Yeah, I believe, didn't you put her in your book as an example of misleading the public and misleading the police?
No, I don't believe so. We talked about Charles Stewart, who said that his wife had been shot by a black man who jumped into the car. There was a case in Rhode Island where the parents claimed that an abductor had come through the window and taken their child, who was later found dead. Yeah. So there's a number of cases over the years where people have made that claim.
So is there something now, 30 years later, that you would have, that you've learned, or that do you have any new theories that you could tell us about?
Well, Steve and I felt it was more likely than not that there was no stranger abduction. Beyond that, we weren't comfortable saying exactly what happened. And a lot of people have read our book and said, oh, you accused Lindbergh of having killed his child negligently. And we didn't. We said that's one possible scenario. I'm reasonably confident there was no stranger abduction. But what exactly happened in the household that night, we can't say. And I think we're clear that Steve and I are clear in the book, although it gets overlooked, that that's one of several possibilities. The reason why we presented that is that it was the least onerous. It was the least accusatory against Charles Lindbergh. He could have done it intentionally, because then there's been this eugenics theory that other authors have come along after us and said that there was something wrong with the baby and that he intentionally killed the child. But that's a lot. That's very obviously an extremely malicious act. It takes almost an evil to kill your child. And then you drop down to maybe a negligent act or an accident that went gone bad, and you didn't know what to do, and you were confused, and you were scared, and you concocted this story, and then you get wrapped up in it, and you get stuck with it. That can happen. That is less accusatory in my mind. So we presented as the most likely scenario, or the one that we promoted the most, was that it was a negligent act. We thought that was the least accusatory thing we could say.
You're
But
right.
we did entertain the other possibilities. Obviously, child abuse is a possibility. Maybe most of these cases where a child disappears, it's as a result of child abuse, and then the parents panic and they bury the child or hide the child's body or whatever.
But he wasn't buried, so that's another issue about the case that's very strange. How hard could it have been to bury a little boy? And yet he was found above ground a mile or so from the house.
Which implies that it was a hurried event that was concocted sort of on the fly. It wasn't. I think it kind of challenges the later theory that some authors have developed, that this was a pre-planned, intentional act.
Right.
But we don't discount that. I mean, that is possible. And after our book came out, we had a number of people who approached us who had some, or claimed to have some close personal knowledge of Lindbergh's relationship with the child, and that there was something wrong with the child, and that he was very offended by it. So,
Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned that somewhere. There was someone who told you the child was deaf, or
well,
that's,
we were contacted by a number of witnesses whose parents had some firsthand knowledge and had always told them that it was clear that there was something wrong with the child, and that Lindbergh seemed to be ashamed of it. Again, even the person telling us that is basing that on secondhand information.
right.
So certainly wouldn't be enough evidence to proceed in a court of law, but that theory is out there. That's a possibility. And
Right.
some authors have taken that theory and run with it and developed, a very direct accusation against Lindbergh. I'm not saying it's not true. I mean, I'm open to any of those possibilities. The only thing I can say with any reasonable confidence is that it is unlikely that there was a stranger abduction on March 1, 1932. Is it
Right.
possible there was a stranger abduction? Sure, it's possible. But there would have to be such a chain of unlikely circumstances all would have had to have occurred that it just seems unlikely.
The ladder, getting through that window when the police could not replicate the kidnapping that way. So many things. The ransom note on a windowsill to be blown away in the wind. What else?
Well, the biggest thing is, why would somebody plan a kidnapping of a child at a house where the child wasn't living? I mean, the Lindberghs weren't living at that house. The decision to stay in that house that night had only been made that afternoon.
Right.
So if there was this well-planned, stranger abduction by a gang or a solo kidnapper or a lone wolf or whatever, who had been plotting this thing for weeks and months, why would you plot to steal a child from a place where he wasn't?
Gregory, you're going to come back for part 2 because the upgrade that I purchased isn't in effect yet.
Okay, all right, we'll get together some other time for part 2.
I'm going to send you a link for part 2, okay?
Some other day.
Uh, okay. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank,
very much.
thank you, Ronelle.
You're welcome.